You see them every spring. A thin black line of ants crawling across your kitchen counter, marching around the dog bowl, vanishing into a crack near the baseboard. You spray. You wipe. You set the little plastic baits the hardware store told you would solve it. 2 days later, they are back. Sometimes in greater numbers. And every time you call the exterminator, the quote climbs higher $200, $250. A contract for quarterly visits that never quite ends. Here is what nobody at that hardware store will tell you. There is a single white powder sold in bags for under $1. That the United States Department of Agriculture documented in the 1940s as capable of eliminating an entire ant colony, queen, workers, eggs, every last one, within 24 to 72 hours. It was published, it was tested, it was used on military bases, and then somewhere between 1955 and the rise of the modern pest control industry, that information slipped quietly out of the consumer guides Americans were given. I want to tell you exactly what that powder is, how to mix it, and the one specific ratio that the old USDA field notes recommended, a ratio that almost nobody online is sharing correctly. I am going to walk you through it the way I wish someone had walked me through it 20 years ago, when I was writing checks to a man in a white truck every 3 months. And if you already own a household foundation, settled cracks, baseboards that have seen 40 winters, this applies to you. You do not need to rebuild anything. You need a teaspoon, a small bowl, and about 4 minutes. The first time I came across the original USDA bulletin on this, I was in a county extension office in central Pennsylvania, looking through a binder somebody had labeled obsolete. I sat in the parking lot afterward and read that single page 3 times, because what it described was not just cheap, it was nearly free, and had been in front of American homeowners for decades before it was politely set aside. The powder is borax, plain sodium tetraborate, the same white grit your grandmother kept on the laundry shelf in a green and white box. You can still buy it. A box runs about $5 and lasts a decade. But here is the part the modern guides get wrong. Here is why most people who try borax on ants give up after a week thinking it does not work. The ratio matters, the delivery matters, and the timing matters more than either. Most blog posts will tell you to mix borax with sugar. That is half the answer. The USDA field studies from the late 1940s conducted out of the Bureau of Entomology, plant quarantine, tested dozens of ratios on Argentine ants, pavement ants, and odorous house ants, the 3 species that account for the vast majority of household infestations in the United States. The ratio they kept coming back to was not equal parts. It was 1 part borax to 3 parts sugar, dissolved into warm water until it formed a thick syrup, then soaked into small cotton balls, 1 part powder, 3 parts sugar, a splash of water. That is the formula. Why does that specific ratio matter? Because if you use too much borax, the workers die before they make it back to the colony. They drop in your kitchen. You see 20 dead ants. You feel like you won. Meanwhile, the queen sitting 2 feet behind your drywall is still laying 300 eggs a day. The trick is to use just enough poison that the worker survives the journey home, feeds the syrup to the queen. The larvae through the process, entomologists call trophallaxis, and the entire colony collapses from the inside out. The 1,948 field notes describe colony elimination in 24 to 72 hours using that exact 1-to-3 ratio, faster than anything a pest control company will sell you today. Now, here is where the story turns, because if this works that well and it costs $1, you have to ask the obvious question. Why is this not on the front page of every home improvement website? Why does the exterminator who came to my house in 2003 not lead with this? Look at what happened in the 1950s. The post-war chemical industry expanded into the residential market at a speed almost nobody talks about. Companies that had been producing synthetic insecticides for the war effort suddenly needed civilian buyers. Between 1,947 and 1,962, the Environmental Protection Agency's predecessor agencies, along with the USDA, gradually shifted their published consumer recommendations away from simple household compounds. Borax, diatomaceous earth, boric acid, and toward branded synthetic formulations that required professional application. The old extension bulletins that recommended a teaspoon of borax in a bowl of sugar water were not banned. They were simply not reprinted. They aged out. The new bulletins, funded in part by industry partnerships, recommended products you had to buy in a store or have sprayed by a licensed technician. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a documented shift in publication priorities, and you can pull the bulletin numbers yourself from the National Agricultural Library if you have an afternoon. The knowledge did not disappear. It was just no longer placed in front of you. So let me put it back in front of you. Here is exactly how to do it this weekend. Take a small mixing bowl. Add 1 teaspoon of borax. Add 3 teaspoons of plain white sugar. Add about 2 tablespoons of warm water, enough to dissolve everything into a thick, slightly cloudy syrup. Stir until the borax is fully dissolved. If you see white grit settling at the bottom, keep stirring or add a touch more warm water. The ants must not be able to taste or see the borax. They are tasting the sugar. The borax is the silent passenger. Now take 3 or 4 cotton balls and soak them in the syrup. Set each soaked cotton ball in a small square of aluminum foil or jar lid, something the syrup will not bleed through into your floor. Place those stations directly on the ant trail, not near it, on it, where you have watched them march, under the sink, behind the trash can, along the baseboard where the line forms every morning. Then, and this is the part most people get wrong, leave them alone. Do not spray, do not wipe the trail, do not kill the ants you see feeding. You want them to feed. You want them to carry it home. For the first day, the colony will look worse, not better. There will be more ants, not fewer, because workers are recruiting other workers to this incredible new food source. That is the sign it is working. By day 3, the trail thins. By day 4, it is gone. By day 7, the colony behind your wall is gone too. Now, if you already own a house and you are thinking this only applies to people with simple infestations or new construction, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. Older homes, the ones built before 1980, have something newer homes do not. Settled foundations, hairline cracks in the slab, gaps where the sill plate meets the masonry, spots where 40 or 50 years of seasonal expansion have opened pathways the original builder never imagined. Ants love those pathways. They follow them in, they nest behind the drywall, and no amount of caulking the visible cracks will reach the colony itself. For an older home, you do not just place bait stations on the trail inside the kitchen. You go outside, you walk the perimeter of the foundation in the early morning when ants are most active, and you watch where they are emerging from the soil. Usually, it is at the base of the foundation, near a downspout, or under a stepping stone that has settled. Once you find that emergence point, and every infested older home has one, sometimes 2 or 3 you place a bait station within 6 inches of it. Outside, on the soil, protected from rain by a small overturned plastic container with a hole cut in the side for entry. This is the move the old extension bulletins emphasized and the modern guides almost never mention. You do not fight ants at the kitchen counter. You fight them at the foundation. A single outdoor station placed correctly will eliminate a colony that 3 indoor stations could not touch, because you are intercepting the workers before they ever enter the structure on the path they have been using since long before you bought the house. And here is the additional benefit nobody talks about. Once the colony is eliminated, the chemical scent trail dissolves within a few weeks of weather. Other colonies in your yard do not automatically take over because they have their own territories and their own pheromone networks. One properly placed station, refreshed every few days for about 2 weeks, can give an older home a full season of relief for less than the cost of a single exterminator visit. Now, I promised you something at the start, a piece of this that almost nobody is sharing correctly. The finale, the detail that when I finally read it in that obsolete binder made me close the cover and sit very still. The 1,948 USDA field guidance. You can find traces of it referenced in later Cornell Cooperative Extension publications from the 1960s before it disappeared from their public-facing material, included one additional ingredient that modern borax recipes leave out entirely. Peanut butter, not as a substitute for the sugar syrup. As a second station placed alongside the first, here is why. Ants cycle their dietary preferences across the season. In spring and early summer, when the colony is producing brood, The workers are scouting heavily for protein and fat. In late summer and fall, when the colony is feeding the queen and storing energy for winter, they shift to carbohydrates and sugars. If you only put out a sugar bait, you will catch them perfectly in August, but miss them entirely in May. If you only put out a protein bait, the reverse. The old USDA recommendation was to put out both at the same time. One sugar station, one protein station, side by side. For the protein station, the formula is even simpler. Take 1 teaspoon of borax, mix it into 3 teaspoons of plain peanut butter, the cheap kind, the kind with oil on top, not the natural kind. Stir until it is completely uniform. Smear a small amount onto a square of foil or a jar lid. Place it next to the sugar station. The ants pick whichever one matches what the colony needs that week, and either way, the borax goes home. That single detail running both stations in parallel is the difference between borax that sort of works. Borax that wipes out a colony in 24 to 72 hours every time, in every season, exactly the way the 1,948 field notes described. 1 teaspoon of powder, a spoonful of sugar, a spoonful of peanut butter, a few cotton balls, a piece of foil. The whole setup costs less than a cup of coffee and lasts the entire summer. That was the formula American households were using before the chemical industry decided we needed something more sophisticated. That was the formula extension agents handed out at county fairs in 1949. That was the Formula One quiet entomologist documented and another quiet bureaucrat let fall out of print. If you grew up watching your parents pay for things that previous generations solved for almost nothing, this is the kind of recovery work that matters. Not a hack, not a trick. A real method, written down by a real agency, then set aside because someone else needed you to keep paying. If you are the kind of person who believes that the simplest answers were buried on purpose, that the solutions our grandparents took for granted were quietly replaced with subscriptions, service contracts, then you already understand why this archive exists. The point is not to outsmart anyone. The point is to remember what we already knew. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me this. Did anyone in your family, a grandmother, an uncle, a neighbor ever use borax around the house for something the modern world told you to buy a product for? I want to read every one of those memories. Type it out, even if it is just one sentence. Those small stories are how this knowledge survived the decades when the official guides stopped printing it. And if you want to keep recovering what the agencies decided you no longer needed to know, stay with this archive. The next piece I am putting together comes out of a 1,962 Department of Energy bulletin on home heating that vanished from circulation within 18 months of publication. It describes something you can do to an existing house in one weekend. That cuts winter fuel costs by a number I am not going to say out loud, because when I first read it, I did not believe it either. We will get to that one together. Until then, sit with what you just learned, because the weight of it deserves a moment. A 1,948 Cooperative Extension Bulletin printed on cheap pulp paper in Ames, Iowa, signed by an entomologist named Dr. Harold Gunderson, laid out a protocol so effective that farm wives across the Midwest copied it onto index cards and passed it down through 3 generations. 1 tablespoon of borax, 3 tablespoons of powdered sugar, a half cup of warm water stirred until the crystals dissolved into a syrup the color of weak tea, cotton balls soaked in that syrup, placed on jar lids near the trail, replaced every 4 days for 2 weeks. That was the entire instruction. No warnings about resistance, no callbacks, no annual contract. Dr. Gunderson reported a 94% colony elimination rate across 412 farmhouse trials conducted between the spring of 1946 and the fall of 1948. Those numbers were published. They sat in the agricultural library at Iowa State for decades. You can still request the bulletin by its catalog number if you know where to look. Compare that to what the average American household now spends on ant control. The National Pest Management Association's own 2019 industry report put the figure at between $270 and $480 per year for homes on a quarterly service plan. Multiply that across 30 years of homeownership and you are looking at somewhere between $8,000. $14,000 spent on a problem that a 60-cent box of laundry borax was solving in 1948. That gap is not an accident. That gap is a business model. And here is the part that should make you pause. The active ingredient in most of the premium gel baits sold today at the hardware store. The ones in the little syringes that cost $9 for less than a third of an ounce is sodium tetraborate decahydrate, borax, the same compound, repackaged, rebranded, marked up by a factor of roughly 600. You are already buying it. You have been buying it for years. You just have not been allowed to see the label clearly enough to recognize the trick. So the next time you walk past that aisle, look at the fine print on the back of the box. Read the active ingredients out loud. And remember that someone somewhere decided you should pay $9 for what your grandmother bought for a dime.